Institutional critique's second generation emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s. These artists questioned all aspects of the process of artistic institutionalization. Artists such as Andrea Fraser, Fred Wilson, and Renee Green examined the relationships between art and class, economics, power, and race, drawing on the identity politics that characterized the new social movements of the time. According to art critic Brian Holmes, they pursued the systematic exploration of museological representation, examining its links to economic power and its epistemological roots in colonial science that treats the other like an object to be shown in a vitrine. One artist who exemplifies this approach is Fred Wilson, who linked institutions of power, such as a museum, with questions of racial politics. For example, his 1991 work, Guarded View, features 4 dark-skinned male mannequins, all headless and dressed in the guard uniforms of New York's major museum. The guard uniforms included the uniform for the Whitney Museum of Modern Art, where the work itself was shown. What point do you think Wilson was trying to make with this work? This work draws attention to the class and race discrepancies that are still prevalent in the institution of art, by reminding us that African Americans are more likely to be seen in a museum on security detail than as either audience or artists. By exhibiting this work in the Whitney Museum of American Art, Wilson challenges the very environment in which it's showcased. The faceless mannequins emphasize the anonymity expected of security personnel, who must protect the art and museum visitors without drawing attention to themselves. Wilson himself worked as a museum guard in college, and he explains.
When you're a guard, you are kind of on display like everything else. You're standing there, you're silent, people walk by you. But like the artwork, you are invisible, and that tension between the two is what really intrigued me and really made me want to make the work. And on top of that, this work was really about having been to museums, going to museums for years, and noting that besides myself and the guards, and perhaps the people in the food service or the maintenance, we were the only African Americans or people of color in the museum. And no one in the professional staff who decides what gets put on display, how those things get described and discussed, what's acquired by the museum. To me, that was also very much a part of why I did this piece.
Interestingly, by exhibiting a work that critiqued itself, the museum had become involved in its own critique. This phenomenon became a more regular theme throughout the second wave of institutional critique. Museums increasingly welcomed artists' interventions. For example, many museums invited artists to rummage through their collections and organize exhibitions that expose the hidden agendas or gaps in their collection. Wilson curated one such exhibition in 1992 at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. Mining the Museum presented the museum's collection in a new, critical light, revealing the institution's long-standing failure to address the contributions of African Americans to the state's history. One gallery, for example, contained a set of pedestals supporting busts of famous white luminaries with no historical relationship to Maryland. Next to them, Wilson places a set of empty pedestals, celebrating in absentia notable Black Marylanders whose busts are not in the Society's collection. According to Wilson, what they put on view says a lot about a museum, but what they don't put on view says even more. In another display, Wilson presented intricate silver pitchers and teacups alongside iron slave shackles. Why do you think Wilson placed these objects side by side? By displaying these artifacts side by side, Wilson revealed the vast differences between black and white histories, implying that the salubrative narratives of the one were made possible by the subjugation enforced upon the other. Like Wilson, Mark Dion is also interested in how museums shape our perception of culture through the collection, classification, and presentation of artifacts and specimens. He's fascinated by taxonomy, a branch of science concerned with the description, identification, and classification, and is influenced by the writings of evolutionary theorist Stephen Jay Gould, who points out that taxonomic systems are not objective, but rather are dependent on our value systems and therefore embedded within social structures. Taking on the role of archaeologist, Dion reenacts and scrutinizes the processes of traditional scientific research. His alternative procedures of collecting, identifying, and classifying objects suggest a more poetic and open-ended approach. In 1999, Dion enlisted a team of local volunteers to comb the shore of the River Thames at low tide along two stretches of beach outside the Tate Modern and the Tate Britain. Their aim was to explore London's rich history through its material remains, the artefacts buried within the mud and gravel of its beaches. Dion instructed the volunteers to collect anything and everything that caught their attention. London's location, its growth, and its fortunes can all be attributed to the Thames. It provided a location for factories, royal palaces, the Houses of Parliament, countless tourist traps, and of course the historic Docklands, which were once the biggest in the modern world, attracting trade from all over the world, including Europe, Scandinavia, the Far East, the Caribbean, and Africa. Given the river's rich and varied history, the team uncovered a wide variety of artifacts and tokens of life, ranging from clay pipes, oyster shells, and cattle teeth, to plastic toys and shoes. The more unusual finds included a bottle containing a letter in Arabic script and a fragment of human shin bone. The finds were then cleaned and classified in archaeologists' tents. The discoveries were then presented in a double-sided mahogany chest in the style of a cabinet of curiosities, alongside photographs of the beachcombers and tidal flow charts. One side of the cabinet is devoted to the finds from Millbank outside the Tate Britain, the other to those from Bankside outside the Tate Modern. Items are organised loosely according to type, such as bones, glassware, pottery, metal objects. The viewer finds them in seemingly unhistorical and largely uninterpreted arrangements. Antiques sit alongside contemporary objects, lost treasures next to ephemera or junk. What significance does the presentation of these artifacts have on the way the work is understood? The conventions of museum display are turned upside down. Crowded with treasures and curiosities in apparently arbitrary and unexpected arrangements, the potency of these objects lies in their associations. Viewers are free to create their own associations. Dion chose to use a cabinet to present his finds from the Tate Thames dig. This presentation makes reference to the curiosity cabinet to make the viewer question why the modern museum is organised in the manner that it is, and what lies behind the rules that curators and art historians follow in the classification and organisation of objects. Dion presents objects that might otherwise be considered rubbish as museum artefacts. Their artistic value depends on their presentation within his cabinet. Louise Lawler also investigates the presentation of art and questions the conventional understanding that artistic value is solely located in an art object's intrinsic qualities. In the early 1980s, Lawler began taking pictures of other artists' works displayed in galleries, collectors' homes, even storage facilities and auction houses. Rather than zooming in on the work itself in the manner of standard art documentation, Lawler's views show art in a context, reminding her audience that a work of art is an object, that it is bought and sold and owned, and that who owns it and how it is displayed are part of its meaning. Through her work, Lawler investigates commodification and consumerism in contemporary culture, and the ways that institutions define, present, and confer value and authority in art. Does Andy Warhol make you cry? presents an image of Andy Warhol's 1962 painting Round Marilyn, photographed at a Christie's auction preview. The auction house label is clearly legible, including the estimated sale price. Lawler includes a label of her own that directly addresses the viewer, asking, "Does Andy Warhol make you cry?" It's difficult to imagine being moved to tears by a reproduction of a work of art, while being forced to consider it as a commodity. Warhol was a recurring motif in Lawler's work, perhaps because of his own hyper-awareness of art as a commodity. Artist Renée Green takes a different approach, creating jarring juxtapositions that depict violent images of enslavement disguised as scenes of benign Victorian leisure. In her 1992 work, Mise en scène, commemorative toile, Green uses appropriation to re-examine history and call attention to its modes of presentation. She utilizes a historic narrative fabric design, making subtle but significant changes. Green combines the traditional rural scenes with violent scenes of enslavement and uprisings. Using this manipulated fabric, Green upholstered chairs and chaise longues and made wallpaper and drapes. The combined impact is reminiscent of the period rooms found in museums, subverted to tell alternative histories. What point do you think Green was trying to make with her work? This work is a highly charged yet subtle commentary on race and social class. Green has stated that the aim of her work is to help people think about themselves in relation to different histories and alternative ways of seeing. Her mise en scène reminds viewers of the two very different versions of the same history, one that was passed down prominently in museum exhibits and through cultural artifacts, and another that was largely silenced. While some artists draw attention to the way history is shaped by the objects and artifacts that are selected and displayed in museums, others are more interested in the structures and mechanisms of the museum itself, like the security, the architectural features, or the museum's educational programs. Performance artist Andrea Fraser is widely regarded as a pioneer of second-wave institutional critique, through both her art and her writings. She is perhaps best known for her gallery talks, which examine the dynamics between the museum and the public. She uses a range of devices to examine the way in which the museum talks about itself. Her language, her attire, her references to museum donations and patronage. One of her best-known works is her 1989 piece, Museum Highlights, a gallery talk. Dressed in a smart grey suit, Fraser assumed the role of fictional museum docent, Jane Castleton. She introduces herself as a guest, a volunteer, and an artist, leading a tour of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Alongside conventional elements of a gallery tour, such as the history of the institution and its collection, Castleton regularly strays off into discussions about the building's toilets, the designs of the drinking fountain, her social connections, and patronage opportunities available for those who want the gift shop to bear their name. During her performance, Fraser uses language that parodies the extensive and exaggerated praise frequently used by docents, presenting the building's structural elements or facilities, such as the drinking fountain or toilets, as an artwork, describing them in the same elevated language that she would use to describe a 17th century Dutch painting, such as when she points to an exit sign and claims, "This picture is a brilliant example of a brilliant school." She addresses a guard stool in the corner of the gallery, in scale and complexity in the great European tradition, free from time and change. She stands in front of a Diego Rivera Liberation of the Peon, and points to the drinking fountain in the corner instead, proclaiming it to be a work of astonishing economy and monumentality. It boldly contrasts with the severe and highly stylized productions of this form. Fraser also addresses the administration and economical aspect of the museum, asking her visitors whether they have paid their administration fee, and inviting them to become a museum member. She also comments on the patronage of museums, telling her audience, for $750,000, you could name the museum shop. She links the economics of the museum to the social status associated with being a museum member or patron. Social status plays a significant role in Jane Castleton's relationship with the museum. Throughout the tour, Castleton repeatedly returns to questions of personal taste and the notions of grace, dignity, and order that she feels artworks, museums, and gallery visitors should embody, stating, "Here you will be liberated from the struggle imposed by material needs. Here you will find your ideal beauty. You will find inspiration. Here you will find a place apart. You will find standards. Here you will find civilization." The museum's purpose is not just to develop an appreciation of art, but to develop an appreciation of values. Why do you think Fraser pays particular significance to the museum's values? Andrea Fraser defines her work as site-specific art that seeks to criticize and analyze aspects of culture that have been largely naturalized. She mimics as well as deconstructs the museum, revealing structural biases, social prejudices, and economic underpinnings of established cultural institutions. Castleton's speeches in the museum highlights draw particular attention to the assumptions that have historically been placed on the value of art, especially in relation to notions of class. As art historian Alexander Albero explains, Fraser does not critique just the institution of the museum. By extension, she also analyzes the type of viewer the museum produces. In her essay, Lookers, Buyers, Dealers and Makers, Thoughts on Audience, artist Martha Rosler discusses the factors that have produced the elitism that characterizes the institution of art more generally. She points to the purchasing power of the upper class and the fundamental role it plays in aesthetic production, affecting the very definition of art by influencing museum exhibitions and collections. Rosler notes that big collectors, aside from keeping the cash flowing, have a great deal of leverage with museum and gallery directors, and are often trustees or board members of museums and granting agencies. For Fraser, Jane Castleton personifies a non-expert volunteer from an upper-class background who possesses the leisure and economic and cultural capital that defines the museum's patron class. According to the artist, Jane Castleton is the museum's representative, and her function is, quite simply, to tell the visitors what the museum wants, that is, to tell them what they can give to satisfy the museum. Live guided talk is meant to authoritatively explain an exhibition. However, museum guides may have no formal art historical training. According to Fraser, they are trained only by the museum's professional staff, and thus acquire a certain quantity of knowledge about art objects. But this knowledge, as it's usually limited to the particular museum's collection, leaves the museum guide entirely dependent on its particular source and without the means to generate a legitimate opinion independently of the institution.